Hi, everyone. Welcome to the SPRC seminar series. My name is Elizabeth Adamson, and I'm one of the coordinators for the seminar series. And I will just give a brief welcome and introductions, and then I will pass it over to Richard in just a moment. So to begin with, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Bidjigal people, who are the traditional owners of the land where UNSW Sydney stands, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. So as I just mentioned, we have Professor Richard Layte here today. He's all the way from Ireland, and one of our first international seminar presenters. He actually is in Australia, which is fantastic, and at SPRC today, unlike myself. He's a professor of sociology, head of Department of Sociology at Trinity College Dublin, and a research professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute in Dublin. And I won't go through the rest of his bio, but it is in the event invite, and you can click on his bio, to his link, to see further information. So Richard will present for approximately 40 minutes, and there will be another, hopefully at least 15 minutes for questions. If you have any quick questions, put them in the chat, but otherwise we'll wait till the end for Richard to go through any of your other questions. And I think that is probably it. I guess, as always, stay on mute unless you're talking, and enjoy the seminar. Thank you. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Liz, and good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to get a chance to come speak with you. And as Liz said, I'm sitting in SPRC at the moment on a lovely sunny day in Sydney. It was lashing rain when I arrived yesterday, but I'm glad to see it's brightened up. So can I just do a quick check? Can you, first of all, can you hear me?
Sorry, Richard, I think you're still on mute.
Okay.
Oh, there we go. Now I can hear you.
Can you hear me now? Is that coming through?
You now.
Okay, that's good. So first check, you can hear me. What about, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Okay, I think we're all set then, aren't we? I can start. So as Liz said, I'm a sociologist from Dublin. I'm at Trinity College in Dublin. And my work looks at a lot of questions around child outcomes as a way of looking at the way that social environment shapes outcomes at the individual level, in terms of outcomes like health, but also in terms of things like education. And so, this paper comes from a program of research, which I've been doing, a funded program of research with colleagues in Dublin, which is looking at the way that home environment and local neighbourhoods shape both the health behaviours of the child in adolescence and their educational outcomes. We're looking at the general question of how poverty influences educational outcomes, okay? And here, what we're doing is we're going to utilise the Great Recession in Ireland as a way of, in a sense, a national experiment or a pseudo experiment scenario to be able to look at that effect. So, just to contextualise and to give you some idea of where this paper is situated. We want to look at education as a major marker in people's lives. It clearly is very important in terms of outcomes for in our societies. Our societies, by that I mean the kind of industrialized, post-industrial societies, rich societies have over time changed the way that we allocate resources. And can I just mute, I think it's Trish. Can I just mute you, Trish? There we go. There was a bit of noise coming through. Sorry about that, Trish. I think you have an open mic there. So our societies have changed in terms of the way that people get allocated to positions in the labour market, and that has a big influence on their overall attainment in terms of income and the quality of job that they might occupy. And education is an increasingly important factor in shaping that attainment that they receive. Now, my machine isn't responding in terms of the slide, so let me just see if I can get this moving. There we go. Okay, now it's going too fast. Right. So education is becoming increasingly important within our societies as the mediator for occupational position. Educational credentials are central in that allocation process. So education, our societies are becoming increasingly educationalized. Educational credentials are your passport, in a sense, to good occupational positions. And of course, with good occupational positions, you tend to get other outcomes like with a higher income and lower chances of unemployment and poverty, leading to better life chances and better health outcomes. And Ireland is a really good example of this. So as Ireland as a society had largely primary educated or higher secondary educated population really until the late 1970s, and there were educational reforms in the late 1960s that led to free secondary education, and that's meant that over time we've seen increasing levels of education within our society, that kind of educational inflation that we see in our societies. And so this chart that you're looking at the moment is taken from a book by Delma Byrne and Emma Smith, two colleagues of mine from the Economic and Social Research Institute, just showing you the increasing levels of education that have been in Ireland over time from 1980 to 2007. And this process has carried on. So now the vast majority of young people in Ireland will go on to, will not finish school until age 18-ish. So they're completing upper secondary education, or leaving certificate as it's known in Ireland. And fewer and fewer are leaving school earlier with a junior certificate qualification or no qualifications at all. And about 2/3 of young people now go on to some kind of third level education. So 2/3 going on to higher education. If you think back to the 1950s in Ireland, that figure would have been well under 5%. Okay, so increasingly educational credentials are very important. And without, the obverse of that is that without at least upper secondary education, you see really high risks of vulnerability to employment, to income poverty, and that risk is increasing over time. In another part of my work, I look at social mobility, and we've seen increasing effects over time in terms of the role that education plays. And education attainment is a really important indicator of social position. It is finely related to family social position and social disadvantage. And that means that it's of real interest to sociologists and social scientists like myself who want to see how early life, and particularly family environment, shape the kind of social advantages and disadvantages that children have. And education is one of those factors that we see as being heavily influenced by family background from a very young age. You know, you're looking at early life here. The first 1,000 days is often mentioned, but to a certain extent, it kind of precedes that in terms of in the prenatal environment. But certainly in those first 3 years of life, what you see are factors that shape their educational trajectories, that are shaping the kinds of the child's ability to be able to participate in school in a way which leads to them developing the kind of cognitive, emotional, and social skills that they require to do well in education. Now, over time, you can see here that across all social groups, we are seeing a decrease in early educational exits. It was always lowest amongst those coming from more non-manual positions, those coming from professional, non-manual locations. and highest amongst those in manual occupation. So these are families. I'm using a social class measure here. I know this isn't often used within the Australian context. I've noticed that people tend to use income measures much more, or the kind of synthetic measures of social position, using things like income and education. I'm using social class here just as an indicator of social advantage. But you can see that over time, decreasing numbers going or leaving education early, but there is a gradient here in terms of the risk of it. And this translates as well into how successful young people are. So they might not leave school early, but they do differentially well in terms of their overall outcomes. So one indicator of that here is leaving certificate points. Okay, so points here are, I think there's an Australian analog of this, which I am searching around for the acronym for. But what this is essentially is in your, at the end of high school, at the end of school at 18, you have the terminal exams, and young people are usually taking 6 or 7 subjects. And each level within that, each outcome level, is allocated a number of points. Okay, and when you add those together, if you're getting something like 300+ points, then you've basically got the entry requirements for 3rd level. If you get 400+ points, well, then you've got the sort of basic requirements for a university course. And 500+, you're looking at one of the more kind of prestigious universities and a prestigious program. And you can see here that we see fairly fine-grained differentiations across those social class positions that I showed you earlier on. So that whereas amongst the professional and higher managerial groups, you're looking at basically 90% of that cohort who've got the wherewithal to be able to go to 3rd level education. When you go up down to the unskilled manual groups, then you're looking at only something like a third will have the points that they require to get into 3rd level, and a much smaller proportion, around about 15%, are going to have the kind of points that they require to get into university. So it's quite fine-grained. You see these social gradients here in educational outcomes, which are clearly related to social position. And this is one of the big problems that we face within the social sciences that look at how the family social position, how background, a child's background influences outcomes, that we see correlation across a number of different dimensions of advantage and disadvantage, such that it's often a process which seems over-determined by lots of different factors, and it's very hard to tease them apart. Okay, it's very hard to find out what is the factor that's influencing educational outcomes. There's been a lot of research looking at poverty and the role of poverty in this process of educational failure or education attainment. And so I'm just pointing on screen here to the sort of wealth of research that there is at this point about the relationship between family poverty and child educational failure. And there's been a lot of educational economics of education research, which has attempted to relate often recession and particularly fathers' risk of unemployment to educational outcomes and high school completion by and large. And that research has shown a fairly strong, robust relationship. And you can see it's fairly cross-national as well. So you've got British research using the British cohort study, 1970. You've got research from Norway, and there's quite a bit of US research as well, all showing quite robust relationships between family poverty, paternal unemployment, and poor educational outcomes. Now, that research has been less successful at finding what are the factors that actually influence, what are the mechanisms, in a sense, what are the mediators of this process. And that's what I want to do in this paper today, okay? As well as identifying a recession effect and how recession directly bore upon the educational attainment of young people, we also want to look at what are the sort of mediating mechanisms here. And I'm going to put forward 2, all right? One I'm going to call the family investments model. And what you're seeing on screen here is a sort of crude schematic of the family investments model. And this would be one that most people watching, I'm sure, are going to know well, which is the idea that family resources, and by that, that can mean, of course, income, but it can also mean things like the educational attainment of parents, the kind of skills that the parents have, their ability to use the resources that are available to them to be able to influence the investments in their child. An investment there can be quite broadly taken. So on the one hand, it can mean paying for education, paying for private education. Okay, it can mean paying for those kind of grind classes, as we call them in Ireland. You know, when trying to improve a child's educational attainments, it can mean the books which you're purchasing in your household, access to the internet. It can mean tutors, but it can also mean, of course, using your own skills as parents to try to improve outcomes for your child. So spending your time with your child, helping your child, going to the school, intervening at school to try to help child when things go wrong. So broadly, we call this sort of family investment model, where parents are investing actual resources and time to create better educational outcomes, better educational development. All right, I'm going to call that the FIM. But this model of the family investments model has variants within economics and within sociology and in psychology, but they all in a sense reflect upon that process of improving the cognitive skills of the child and educational skills of the child so as to get better educational outcomes. But there's another way of looking at, or another mediating mechanism that we could see might be important here, which I'm going to call the family stress model. Okay. So the family stress model is a model which emerged in the 1980s, but it has its antecedents in research from people like Glenn Elder back in the 1960s, where they were looking at the effect of depression on child educational outcomes or child behaviors. And in the 1980s, Glenn started working with researchers in Iowa, trying to look at the effect of rural recession on family outcomes and family processes. And the family stress model emerged as a way of understanding how poor child mental health, particularly things like externalizing conditions and internalizing conditions, emerged from the family's experience of recession, and particularly the way that that impacted on family economic strain. And you can see that again in my simplified flow chart here, where low income, high debts and high debts to assets ratio, plus those negative financial events, that all impacts on the parents' experience of financial strain, which then leads to worse parental and maternal mental health, which itself can have an impact on the relationship between the parents, but it also has a crucial influence on the kind of parenting that parents offer their children. Parents become more hostile, they become less warm, they become more inconsistent in their parenting. And that can have a big bearing on the child's mental health in terms of those internalizing and externalizing conditions that I spoke about, which themselves have then an impact on the child's educational development. So this is the second model that I'm going to put forward today here. Okay, so we have a family investments model, but also the family stress model. And whereas one focuses on cognitive development and educational skills, the second one focuses on a psychosocial process. And the way that psychosocial process hinders the child in the classroom in terms of relating to peers and teachers and being able to actually focus on their research. Right? So how are we going to look at these two processes? Well, we're going to use Ireland's fiscal crisis as a kind of a natural experiment to be able to look at the effect of recession on young people and be able to measure this using longitudinal data. So this is a quick slide to show you the extent of Ireland's fiscal crisis, which is, as you can see, in terms of the percent of GDP change year to year, was very pronounced for Ireland. The Irish economy had been reliant on transaction taxes, and the tax base had become fairly narrow. So when there was a sort of an economic collapse and tax receipts plummeted, expenditures were increasing because of the need for social protection. And this led to Ireland essentially becoming financially unviable and having to go to the troika of the IMF and the EU and World Bank to be able to bail Ireland out so that we had money for for the population. It was a pretty severe recession. And you can see that here in terms of the increases in lifestyle deprivation for the population between 2007 and 2013. Big increases amongst all groups, but particularly amongst children. It's always children that experience higher rates of poverty in most countries. But you can see there increases amongst all population groups over time, using lifestyle deprivation, which is a standard measure in Ireland in terms of access to particular resources or access to particular activities. We are going to analyze this using data from a child cohort study, okay? It's the Growing Up in Ireland cohort study, longitudinal study of children, like akin to the one that there exists in Australia. I'm using cohort 98. I've said children born in 1999 there, but they were born in both 1998 and 1999. 8,500 children. We have interviews with both parents, teachers, and carers. And our first interview was in 2008, but then we subsequently followed them up in 2011 and 2015. And it probably won't have escaped your attention there, that what this means is we can follow those families through the Great Recession. So you can see the first data point here, and I'm overlaying these data points on the official unemployment rate for Ireland. And you can see the first one, the data was collected in 2008, just as the recession was about to kick off. And then we see a steep rise in unemployment. And the second data point we're collecting in 2011, 2012 is at the height of the recession, when unemployment had basically tripled, and when the level of GDP had plummeted. And then we have a third data point in 2015. And we're going to be using data from all three data points to be able to look at educational outcomes at 2015, when the children were taking their junior certificate examinations, okay? So this is sort of like a middle school qualification. So our sample starts off at 8,500, but we lose some children and families to follow up, as often happens in these types of cohort studies. So we're down nearly 2,500 children by the time we get to the 17, 18. So there's 6,216 children available for inclusion. I've then decided here to look at just dual parent households, okay? The paper that is associated with this, or one of them, also brings in single parents as a sort of sensitivity test. But essentially here today, I'm just going to be looking at dual parent households. And we've got about 5,000 young people to be able to examine, okay? We also have then measures of recession. We have a measure of experience of particular recession events. These are things like, I'll show them to you in a moment, okay? But there are things like unemployment and income decreases. We have very good income measures at all three time points. And then we have different measures of our two mediating processes. So the family stress model, we're going to be measuring using parental mental health. As I mentioned, you see higher levels of, or it's likely to lead to depression amongst parents when they're experiencing more economic strain. But we're also going to be looking at the strengths and difficulties questionnaire, which gives you measures of internalizing and externalizing conditions for the child. For the family investments model, we're looking at broad measures of parental investment in the children. So number of books, non-adult books in the family home at age 9. Parental attendance at parent-teacher meetings in their school, how often the parent is helping with schoolwork, and the child's days absent from school. And the idea here is to try to get measures of the way that the parents are interacting with their child in the ways that develop them cognitively and in terms of their educational skills. So what are our recession experiences between 2011 and 2012? We could look at recession in terms of economic strain. Indeed, in other versions of this paper, I have looked at economic strain for parents. But here, what I'm going to be focusing on are these recession experiences from 2011, 2012. And so it's things like they're asked when the child was 13. So the recession, if you remember, is happening between the child being age 9 and being age 13. And the parents are asked, did you experience loss of your job, redundancy? Did you get a reduction in your hours? Were your wages or social welfare reduced? Were you experiencing more deprivation? Could you not afford luxuries? And did you have to cut back on certain basics as well, like food and clothes? Were you falling behind on rent and mortgage and on your bills? These different recession experiences are all used to try to build a measure of the experience of recession. Now, you can see from this slide that a large proportion of people were experiencing one or more of these recession events. 70% of the families experiencing a reduction in wages and reductions in social welfare, because of course government was cutting back its social protection budget as far as it could to try to reduce exposure. So this slide shows you a high proportion of our sample experiencing measure or some aspect of recession in their lives, which we can then look at in terms of the effect it had on the child's educational outcomes at those exams at age 15, the junior certificate exams. But there's an important question that we have to deal with here about the extent to which the experience of recession was random, as we would expect in some kind of normal experiment, isn't it? So the experimental procedure is usually to randomly allocate people between intervention or control, and that random allocation, of course, takes care of the basic characteristics that might make people more vulnerable or susceptible to the outcome. And but we don't have random allocation here. We're having something of a natural experiment. But of course, recession isn't something which is randomly visited upon the population. And you can see that in this slide here, that in terms of recession events, whereas the professional managerial classes were less likely to have 3 or more events and more likely to have 0 or 1, that pattern begins to change as the classes become more manual, so that by the time we get to the semi and unskilled, you're having large proportions, 30-odd%, who are experiencing 4 or more recession events. And so there is a gradient here in terms of the experience of recession. And that means that we're having this selectivity here that we're going to have to deal with, aren't we? Because usually when we're looking at educational failure, there are going to be factors which are associated with educational failure in the family that are going to be correlated with their experience of recession. The factors which predict both, in a sense, need to be dealt with. We need to have a way of dealing with that kind of selection pressure. I'm going to skip over that one and talk about our outcome measure, our dependent variable, just before I come back to our method in a moment, because I was going to show you the way that we're going to deal with that selection process, which is via what I'm going to be calling a propensity score methodology. Okay, so to reiterate, what we need to do is we need to adjust for the fact that some families are more likely to experience recession, and those factors that make them more likely to experience recession are all those also the ones that make them more likely to experience educational failure in the first place. Okay, because there are things like social disadvantage leading to a sort of impoverished or less rich environment in the household that then leads to worse education outcomes. And usually what we would do is we would just adjust for differences statistically, wouldn't we, across different households? We'd adjust for those background characteristics. But that's not a particularly strong way of trying to deal with this kind of confounding problem that we have. A more effective way is to use what's known as a propensity score measure. And what we do here is we use factors that condition the risk of experiencing recession. Okay, we make a measure of people's propensity to experience recession, and then what we do is we compare people at the same level through a matching process, the same propensity to experience recession, but of course some of those people will have experienced recession and others not. So what we can do is we can directly compare people at the same risk of recession, but who nonetheless varied in their actual experience of recession. And you can see that in my chart here. So the x-axis there is the propensity score. That's the propensity to experience recession. You can see that's kind of low on the left, high on the right. And what we can do then is we can look at the effect for people who've got the same propensities. Say we look at the middle segment, okay? And some of those people will have experienced recession. They're the ones marked with an R, and others will not experience recession. And we can look at the mean difference between them in terms of their junior certificate attainment, where the junior certificate here is our educational outcome. So that's the method that we're going to be using. Okay, once we've established the real or true impact of recession, what we can then come back to is look at the mediating mechanisms that I mentioned earlier on. Okay, let me just quickly mention our outcome measure. So that is the total points. I mentioned earlier on the leaving certificate points process. This is identical, okay, but it's happening when the child's younger in their junior certificate process. And so we have a number of subjects between 9 and 13. The child takes an exam in them, and we're allocating points on the basis of the grades they received in the exam, and we sum them all together to produce the total points that the child has. Okay, right. So with just under about 10 minutes to go, let's look at some of the patterns that we saw. Okay, the actual outcomes. So let's look at the change in both our dependent variable, but also some of our mediating mechanisms by the family's experience of recession. So on the horizontal axis there, the x-axis, we can see the number of recession effects experienced, right? Remember my list from earlier on. And what we can see here is as the family experiences more, these descriptive analysis shows us that as the number of recession effects increases, we see increases in maternal depression, very steep increases in maternal depression risk. That's the CESD score. And what you're looking at here is the proportionate change in CESD score. CESD is our measure of depression. And you can see the proportionate change between 2008 and 2011. I'm just trying to standardize them so they can all be seen on the same chart, really. And you can see here, maternal depression increases strongly with number of recession effects, just as father's risk of depression does too. But notice that the mother's rise in depression is much steeper than for fathers. We also see a worsening of child psychological adjustment. That's that SDQ measure that I mentioned earlier on, and things like child absence from school, which increases as recession effects increase. But notice the green line there shows you the impact on points achieved in those junior certificate examinations at 15. And you can see there, although it's clearly not linear because it's increasing to one recession effect in terms of the number of points, as recession effects increase, what we see is a decrease in the points gained at junior certificate. So descriptively, at least, we seem to have something of certainly an issue here, which we should look into in more depth, because it looks like, from a descriptive level, that there is a case to answer, doesn't it? All right, so I've already looked at that one here. So let's look at what we actually see here when we do that propensity score effect. All right, so we build our propensity score. I have a large number of factors which predict your experience of recession. So that's things like the parents' education level. That's things like the health of the parents, previous experiences of unemployment, high number of factors. I think we had something like 16 factors in the model. That creates a probability of experienced recession, okay? But of course, what we can then look at is the difference between those who actually experienced recession and those that didn't experience recession. And I'm doing that in terms of, to give you some sensitivity analysis here, the number of recession effects that they experience. You can see that in my chart here. So we're looking at the mean treatment effect for recession in terms of points that the child achieved at junior certificate, okay? Comparing the treated, which is the people who experienced recession, compared to the control, the families who didn't experience recession. And then you get the mean difference and whether that's significant. And you can see here, using what's known as nearest neighbor matching. Okay, so what is that? That's simply that we take the two groups, okay, and for those who have been treated in terms of experienced recession, we find them a nearest neighbor match in terms of their propensity score. And then we directly compare their mean to the nearest neighbor match, all right? And you can see here that our difference increases in terms of the mean points difference as the number of recession effects experiences increases, and at 2+, it becomes significant in terms of our t-test, all right, and the significance of it increases as the number of recession effects goes up. This is a similar slide in many ways, but what it's showing is using a kernel matching approach as opposed to nearest neighbor matching that I showed you before. So we know using these analyses that there is a mean difference between our groups once we've done that propensity score matching process. But the question is, what is the process that explains this? Is it that FIM process I mentioned, or is it the FSM process that I mentioned? And what we're going to do is we're going to look at that using a decomposition process, all right, of the effect of the recession. So standard decomposition is you're looking at the contribution of different factors, aren't you, to the differences in outcomes. What I'm going to do though is I'm going to use that propensity score stratification, right? So people at different levels of propensity score. I am going to use a kind of matching technique and a decomposition within the matching technique. How does this work? We're going to use a fixed effects analysis. All right. So think of it this way, right? We divide up our propensity scores into 20 groups. 20, well, let's call them bins. All right. So we stratify people from the lowest propensity to the highest propensity. We then have our 20 bins. So the people on the 20th bin have the highest propensity to experience recession. The people in the lowest bin have the lowest propensity to experience recession. And we're only comparing people within bin, okay? So it's a fixed effects decomposition. It's a within estimator. And you can see that on screen here in terms of we're differencing on both the left and the right-hand side of the equation, all right? And that gives us the ability to look at the role which our mediating factors have, all right, but only within people who are very similar in terms of their propensity to experience recession. Okay, so what was the outcome? Well, when we put in our baseline adjustment, all right, so these are, think of this in terms of the FIM and FSM factors. Right, so this is parental mental health and child's mental health. We're looking at them in wave one, okay, prior to the experienced recession. Once we adjust for them clearly, and we're putting in the FIM processes as well, what we see is a clear decrease in the unadjusted recession effect. Okay, so clearly there are between family differences in the educational outcomes which are not cleared up by the propensity score approach, and the baseline adjustment is then bringing in more control in a sense for confounding, and that sort of strongly reduces the recession effect. When we add in household income, we get a big effect too, but in terms of our two mediating processes, which of course are both in a sense pivoting around income change, aren't they? And they're both influenced by income, although of course, it might be that there are other factors there like unemployment, but also the economic strain and psychosocial processes, which are not always directly overlapping with income. But nonetheless, we see a big impact for income change. And we see a significant reduction in the recession effect with the parental, the family investment model factors. But what stands out here is the much larger effect that we get for the family stress model factors. Those psychosocial factors appear to be much more important. So that when we combine those with income, in that's the bar on the far right of our chart here, what you see is that we have a much larger decrease for 1+ recession effects. Okay, when we look at, if we do some sensitivity analysis, and we look at 4+ recession effects, we get an even bigger effect, all right? But again, it's the combination of income with the family stress model variables, which is explaining the recession effect, or a larger part of it than those factors which are in the family investments model. This is much more about family process than it is about cognitive development. All right, so let's have some conclusions from that with 1 minute to go. We've got that really long-standing association between poverty and educational failure that we're trying to get some crack open and get some insight into here. And it's quite clear that this recession, these recession effects of islands support the findings from other research that poverty, family poverty, child poverty is a really strong predictor of poor outcomes, and the poverty is very strongly implicated in educational failure. So here, with the recession in Ireland, we can see that it reduces junior certificate points by around 2 to 5%. All right, depending on how you measure it. Now, that's a sort of significant effect. It's not a huge effect. If you measure this using economic strain as opposed to recession effects, you see a sort of effect size of about 15 to 20%, which is not huge, but is nonetheless pretty significant, and can have a large bearing on possibly on the child's subsequent educational and occupational trajectories, particularly if it influences their transition into higher education or third level education. What's important here, though, is that this effect of recession is largely explained by psychosocial processes more than it is by cognitive processes that bound up with FIM. Do we have strong policy implications? I'm not going to go through these in detail, here, but yes, clearly there is. We need to avoid volatility in family incomes. We need to avoid those income cliffs that come with change. That means trying to have income protection of families, trying to make sure that they have high replacement rates where they lose their source of income. But of course, we also have to think here as well about trying to make families less vulnerable to recession via things like active labour market policy, but also having services available both to families and to children in schools that are going to help them to mitigate the effects of recession when they do indeed occur. Look, I've got to my 40 minutes, so I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much for listening. Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask? I can stop sharing. I hope I didn't go through that too quickly, delivering quite a lot of material quite quickly. And I'm sure there are a few questions there.
Yeah.
Liz, do you want to, are you chair?
I'm happy for you to. It usually happens quite organically. I can see Ben and somebody else had their hand up, but we'll start with Ben.
Hi, Ben.
Hi, Richard. I'm Ben Edwards from the ANU. Thanks very much for the Australian National University. Thanks very much for your presentation and very interesting paper. Couple of thoughts. I mean, I think it's a really nice paper. So firstly, congratulations. One question I had was, there's been quite a lot of work in looking at economic recessions, looking at the extent to which, so one of the questions I have really is around, okay, so psychosocial factors are really important, but in an economic downturn, lots of people are experiencing the same phenomenon. So they're losing their jobs and so on. So, and there's some discussion in the literature about the extent to which job loss and economic pressure in a comparative sense, if everyone's experiencing it, is it, yes, it's bad, but it may not be quite so bad. So I guess it's a question, did you think about that? Did you look at that? And then I guess the other question I've got, so a lot, the matching models that you have rely on observables, and I know you've done some difference within the bins, so to speak, but I'm wondering, you didn't sort of talk about it, but I'm sure you have, to what degree you have groups within those different different social class areas that you can't match. So there's some people who just are unmatchable. How much have you, to what extent have you excluded people based on area of common support? Because that has implications for the generalizability of results. So 2 questions.
Okay, thanks for those good questions. In the paper, one of the papers associated with this, I discussed those questions about is it different in recessions? As you said, there's that work from people like Andrew Oswald, isn't it? Looking at the way that in recessions, when there's more people who are, when it's a more widespread experience, well, then that might take some of the sting out of it. In a sense, there's less individual attribution, isn't there? It's more that this is a societal wide effect, and therefore that might take some of the sting out of it. And in that respect, it might be that outside of recessions, these effects are larger. But what we're seeing here is actually quite a conservative measure of the effects of low income and income loss. And that these, if we'd have measured these processes at another point in time, not during the Great Recession, then we would have seen something larger than that. And I think there's some merit in that. Certainly, Andrew has shown that there are larger effects in terms of subjective outcomes during non-recession time frames. And it's worth looking at that. What this paper is trying to do, of course, is do the causal identification, isn't it? It's trying to use the recession as a way of cracking open that general relationship that we tend to see between all these different factors and get some insight into it. Yeah, so there's more work to come on that in terms of looking at these processes in different time periods.
So just a quick point of clarification. So I'm thinking about regional variation as well. So are there particular areas of Ireland that are more affected than others, and whether that can help you get a handle on that?
Yeah, good point. You could do it, couldn't you, in that kind of ecological way, and try to actually use that as an instrument in a way to look at to recession. You couldn't do it with these data because these data are not decomposable by region, because we don't get that information. They don't ship it with the data set. Too many anonymity problems, and data protection problems, so they don't tend to do that. But it is something you could do using other data. You of course need quite a lot of variables to do the kind of analysis that I've done here, and those kind of data are not routinely available in other data sets. But yeah, good idea. And my colleague Didier Fouage has done some work of that kind, but using British data. Look at those things. Your second question on the propensity score matching on observables, yeah, a lot hangs, doesn't it, on those propensity scores. We need a general mechanism here, or method, for trying to do a better job of get rid of the confounding. And it's going to be very sensitive to what you put into your propensity score analysis. So we've got quite a lot of factors in there. They are, of course, as you say, all observables. There are going to be other factors there that we're not observing that nonetheless may vary between our groups, and to the extent that they are not correlated with the observables, then we've got a problem. So in terms of the method that we used, we've got the different matching techniques, and as you said, they themselves are going to be dependent upon the extent to which you can find neighbors which you can match to. I did it using various techniques. The effects were pretty robust to the different techniques. I played around, of course, with the propensity score itself, putting factors in. And what you're trying to maximize always is, of course, that balance property, aren't you? What you're trying to show is that once you've adjusted, when you've got a good model for your propensity, then there's no significant differences on those factors within your bins. And we achieve that, and in the paper, which can be circulated, that gets achieved. Now, within our decomposition technique, we were simply doing it on the propensity score itself. So we're creating bins, and it's actually more propensity stratification as opposed to matching. Maybe yourself, Ben, or maybe somebody else out there is a better statistician than me and can show me methods to be able to do this without using the stratification approach and do better matching. But the fixed effects decomposition I've found has been very stable and a useful method for trying to get at this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Bruce, was it Bruce second, Liz?
Yes, I can see Bruce up next.
Hi,
Yeah.
Bruce.
Hi again. Yes, I suppose my comments are in the same vein as Ben's about different strategies for identifying these effects. So as you're clearly aware, there are limitations with the propensity score matching. Within each of those bins, while people have the same estimated propensity to experience recession effects, obviously some did and some didn't, so there's something different about them. And so the question is, what is that? So I suppose my thoughts, trying to think of other strategies that you could potentially use in future research. So I've got a couple of suggestions. I suspect both of them won't be feasible, but I think it's an interesting discussion to think about what data one could have.
Yeah, thank you.
And so one strategy would be if you actually had data on the child's school performance before the recession, then perhaps you could do some sort of child fixed effects, looking at, say, were they top of the school before the recession and then moved down towards the middle of the school later on, and so on. So perhaps you don't have that data. And then the other is whether you've got information on their siblings' outcomes. So perhaps, say, older siblings who did that school exam prior to the recession. So then you could do family effects and look at the difference between the siblings in those different experiences. So, okay, not knowing your data at all, they're just a couple of suggestions, and I suspect you knock them down, but then some comments.
No, they're good suggestions. Thanks, Bruce. And that's what we want to do, don't we? We want within child, if we can identify this, we'd like within child effects. We want to see that they're on one trajectory beforehand, recession comes along and then knocked onto another trajectory as a function of their experiences of recession. And within Growing Up in Ireland, we have measures of the child's educational development, really all the way through from 9 years of age for this cohort. We have educational development and cognitive development for our younger cohort. There's also another Growing Up in Ireland cohort, I didn't mention them. They're called cohort 08, and we met them first 9 months, and we have data on them now all the way up to 13 years. They also went through the recession, of course, though, from 9 months of age. So yeah, we can measure things like child, we've got child educational development at different age points, 9, 13, 17, 18. The difficulty is always having the same metric, isn't it? So things like, for example, the British Ability Scales for our younger cohort. For the older cohort, we have what are called Drumcondra reading and math scores at 9. We have another indicator at 13, and our first educational outcome is at 15, where we have the June certificate. So we have no identical measures at at different points in time to be able to look at that trajectory, which is a bit of a shame. You can do things like percentile, couldn't you? You could look at the extent to which, within, if you had measures of educational development, you could look at the way that a child went from being in the top 10%, 10% of the distribution to being in, say, the bottom 20% of the distribution. And you could look at how their trajectory may have changed in terms of percentile and do something like that.
Yeah, I haven't
go on.
I've seen it done, but I imagine you'd have to sort of embed those different measures in some sort of overall theory of how they combine together to produce the educational outcomes in the final observation.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's always going to be open to, you're measuring apples and pears there, isn't it? Or apples and oranges usually. These are different measures and they're going to have different properties. Therefore, you can't directly compare. Sibling comparisons, again, good suggestion, because there are going to be family fixed effects that we could look at. And so you could look at variation across siblings with one experience in recession, the other not, and how that, and decompose it that way. We don't have measures of siblings within Growing Up in Ireland. So unfortunately, we can't look at that. But using some other studies, you might be able to look at these types of effects. I'm thinking here maybe some of the household cohort study, and not cohort, panel studies may have these kind of measures you can draw upon. Things like Understanding Society, for example, that may have those kind of measures. But yeah, I think the logic is a good one, and those are nice suggestions. The extent to which we can do it would be the difficulty. Thank you. Any other questions?
Anyone else have any other questions or comments for Richard?
Josephine.
Hello, Richard. Thank you for that presentation. That was excellent. Quick question. I think at the beginning, if I've understood right, you said you excluded single parent households. I wondered why you made that decision. I would have thought that actually those households would have had a lot more financial strain.
Yeah, the decision was taken on in terms of the measuring the FSM processes, because part of that process was the relationship between the parents that we were putting into the models. And therefore, that's different in single parent households compared to dual parent households. We did do some sensitivity around this, though, with single parent households as well. And you get a very similar process within single parent households. The difficulty is, of course, that our confounding processes are actually exaggerated or exacerbated rather in single parent households. Particularly in the Irish context, single parent households are at a much higher risk of income poverty and deprivation, and that can have it. You need to try to remove some of that extra risk that you see for those parents, which you can do to a certain extent using those propensity score methods that I employed here. And when you do employ those, you see the same patterns that we saw for the dual parents.
Great, thank you. Was there anything else, Richard? I know you cut your slides a little bit short time-wise, but if there's anything else you wanted to touch on.
Well, maybe we can go back to some of the policy implications.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know as a centre and as an institute, you're interested very much in the policy implications of these kind of things, and increasingly, as I do research, what I see is that early life is a very sensitive period for children, and that these types of shocks to the family's financial situation and to their welfare when the child is young can have these really important effects, not only in terms of educational development, but in terms of things like their health as well. So I've got other research that shows that with recession, you see increases in child chronic disease, which has long-term implications for them. And we've got good physical measures of that. So that would suggest, wouldn't it, that the policy implication here is that you try to protect young families. What you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that they've got less volatility in incomes, and you're quick to try to maintain their incomes when recession occurs. So you're going to need to have a fairly agile social welfare system and be able to intervene with sort of high rates of replacement for those families if you're to stop this kind of volatility occurring, which is not always so, within the Irish context, for example, or in the British context. I don't know what the situation is in Australia, but it's probably not the income and welfare transfers are probably not going to be the only answer to this, are they? Because clearly, if our primary process is a psychosocial process, it's about family interaction, then yes, clearly by increasing their incomes, they should experience less economic strain, and that should lead to less stresses and strains and conflict within the family with beneficial effects. But losing your job is not just about income, is it? Losing your job can also have big implications for you in terms of your perception of yourself, your identity as breadwinner, or as, functioning adult. And so that would suggest that there's some sort of family processes or services which help families to be able to deal with these types of situations where redundancy occurs or where major life changes occur, would also be really beneficial. That this is true of all families. I have to say that when we did these analyses, we didn't find interactions here between the level of education of the parents or the level of income of the parents prior to the recession. When more advantaged or rich parents lose their jobs and their incomes decrease, they react in just the same ways that lower income parents react when they lose their jobs and their incomes. We see equally steep disimprovements in parenting practices with those parents. So what this suggests is that across the income distribution, across households, that there should be a kind of like an environment here, a child protection environment, which is providing services to households that helps them, you know, to get through these types of environments. We'd like the families themselves to be able to provide some of this. We'd like, for example, you know, there to be a support network in the family, but that isn't always available. So families don't always have that, and indeed the family network itself might be experiencing recession. So that suggests another kind of policy avenue here that might improve things. I saw Jerry Redmond's hand going up when I mentioned that. Did you want to come in on that, Jerry?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Really good presentation. Sorry, I'm coming in a bit late on this. Just one very short question. I'm wondering about the longer term effects, so that we see this massive effect on outcomes during the Great Recession and just after. But is there what's the evidence that this has carried on since in some way, either with the next generation of children or with presumably with the same children as they get older?
Yeah, really important question. You know, this might just be like the storm that blows in and is, you know, leads to circumstances being less than ideal with implications for the kids. But nonetheless, when the storm recedes, things right themselves. Everybody comes back to their prior situation, and we're okay. Or what I can say is that this is something we're going to need to look at as these young people get older. We have the same cohort now at 20, and we're measuring them again at 25 soon. So we're going to be able to look at their leaving certificate outcomes, okay? So that as I was just mentioning, this is when they're 18, 17, 18, they're taking their high school, you know, term exams. And then entrance to third level and universities. How well did they get on there? Did it have an impact on that? What was the process behind that? I haven't got the paper with me here and it isn't finalized, but the leaving certificate effects seem to be quite robust for recession. So it does look like it has a longer bearing. And the question would be, why is that? Is that because the earlier experience of recession influenced their kind of pattern of educational engagement, you know, and it sort of led to them changing the way that they were behaving in the classroom, or the kinds of their own perception of what their future looked like? Or you know, what was the mechanism? How did it actually have a long-term impact? Was it a psychosocial mechanism, or were there other factors going on there in the sort of longer term? That's all to be looked at, and we have good data in Growing Up in Ireland to be able to look at these things. Would also be good to see for the younger cohort, these kids that were at the time, they were infants, you know, they were 9 months of age prior to the recession. We saw them again at 3 years of age. Obviously sort of in the depths of the recession, and it would be interesting to see, did that have a subsequent bearing on their own educational trajectories? And I suspect it might have been, because at that point, those younger kids would have been even more plastic than the older kids in terms of the impact it might have had. So there's a lot of research to do here, Jerry. Someone needs to use the more Growing Up in Ireland data to look at this. And of course, British data as well, because the Brits, austerity was visited upon the British population to a really major extent. And Brexit, in some respects, you know, was a bit of a consequence of the austerity that happened.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Richard, for those closing both policy implications and kind of further research possibilities. So thank you very much. If we can all join myself and others to say thank you to Richard for presenting his research today. We're very happy to have you here, even though we can't physically be there at the SPRC. So thank you very much, and safe travels.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, guys. And I'm enjoying Sydney.
Great. Thanks, Richard.
Take care now. Bye-bye, everyone.